Here is a significant battle of the Second Seminole War, the Battle of Hatchee-Lustee Creek, on January 27th, 1837. And it's a very significant battle because it forced the Seminoles uh, to parley with Jesup soon after. It's also significant because it involves the Commandant of the Marine Corps, the highest commanding officer in the Marine Corps. So, anyway, General Jesup was made commander of forces in Florida, and this was right after the Battle of Wahoo Swamp. Jesup came to Florida from the Second Creek War after pretty much negotiating an end, although it didn't end yet, but that's a different story. I won't talk about that. Um, so Jesup was making a campaign in Florida, and this would be his first major campaign, building a regiment of regulars and volunteers, which would include the Marines, the Alabama Volunteers, and the Creek Indian Regiment. So quite a diverse force. So General Jesup, to get all the Army soldiers out in the field that he had made an agreement with the Navy and the Marine Corps to get the sailors and Marines and have them garrison the forts, especially on the Fort Brooke, Fort King Road, Fort Brooke, Fort Foster, Fort Dade, Fort Armstrong. And so the Marines were garrisoning the fort. Uh, General Jesup put Colonel Archibald Henderson in charge. Archibald Henderson, the commander of the Marine Corps, Commandant of the Marines, highest ranking officer. So he was put in charge of Fort Brooke at the beginning, but he would eventually go with Jesup on the campaign because I imagine he didn't want to sit in the fort. He wanted to go out and get some of the action. So at Fort Brooke, the 6th Infantry arrived, which would also take part in Jesup's campaign, and they were commanded by Major Alexander Thompson. He would later get promoted to lieutenant colonel, and he would receive brevet colonel. Uh, it is pretty much around the time he was killed at the Battle of Okeechobee, almost a year later. And in fact, almost 11 months to the day of the time we're talking about. So, anyway, the Marines at this time, in let's say 1837, 1838, only had 59 officers in the whole Marine Corps. That's including Colonel Henderson. So there was not very much room to further your career in the Marines. So many of the Marines would tend to join the Army instead. For example, John T. Sprague, who wrote the book on the Florida War, he starred in the Marines, and he was actually escorting some of the Creek Indians removed from Alabama and Georgia to the Western Indian Territory. Then John T. Sprague became a lieutenant in the Army, and he did pretty good for himself because he married the daughter of General William J. Worth. And another officer that started in the Marine Corps was the Army Adjutant General Roger Jones. So, they certainly had a plan, at least to advance their career further on in the Army. The Marines were just too small at that time. One of the officers who went the other direction was Andrew Ross. He was in the 7th Infantry at the Battle of New Orleans, and he got in some controversy because his redoubt was actually stormed by the British at the Battle of New Orleans. He fought them off, but the controversy was is that he failed to keep the British out, even though I think it wasn't so much his fault because the British had just defeated Napoleon. Well, after a few years, he quit the army and he joined the Marines, and he was killed at the Battle of Wahoo Swamp in November 1836. So you have over a 20-year period where Andrew Ross is the first Marine officer killed in a combat operation or mortally wounded in over 20 years. The next major combat operation the Marines would participate in is the Battle of Hatchee-Lustee Creek, which I'm talking about here. So the regiment that Jesup was building of Marines and regulars also included Alabama volunteers and Creek Indian Scouts. And so overlay a modern map, give you an idea where they went. Well, let's Dade battlefields to the west of Lake Apopka over here. And Jesup came up the Fort King Road, went to Fort Dade, stayed there while Colonel Henderson goes to Fort Armstrong and disassembles the garrison there and packs everything up. And then they go out on the march on the road and they go down to near Lake Apopka and raid an Indian village of Chief Cooper or Usachi. Um, and once that happens, then they head south and go down to what's now Kissimmee area and where the Hatchee-Lustee Creek is. But before they get there, they have to cross what we call today the Mid-Florida Ridge or the Lake Wales Ridge. You can see it on the satellite map here from the USGS. It's a sandy ridge, and what it is, it's the remnants of a very ancient seashore when all that was out of the water in Florida was some islands, and these are remnants of the beach. You can see some of that today. Visit, like, if you go to the Lake Placid area, Lake Placid Bridge, it's this very white beach sand here, and it's very difficult to climb over. I've hiked over and climbed over it before, and it, it's very slow moving and very tiring. It's one of the most miserable areas to backpack over because it's like you don't make much progress. So anyway, they came down the ridge. Here you see Palaca, Abraham's Town, and Fort Armstrong Dade's Battle. They go Lake Apopka. This road here says General Jesup's route in 1837. They go over the Thwahutke or the White Mountains, they call it, high sand hills, and they go down the road and near Lake Toho, Tehopapalaga, and in that area, they come across uh, one of the Seminoles' cattle ranges, and they capture the cattle and the horses, which severely cripples the Seminoles' logistics of beef and supplies. At that point, in fact, where they capture it is up around here, probably. Same area that cattle are raised today. And they're going down here, and the road kind of splits at one point, and Colonel Henderson goes one way, and Jesup's adjutant, Lieutenant Chambers, heads on another route and starts to go in the swamp, and they run into some of the women and children. Call back, and Lieutenant or Colonel Henderson's command comes back around, and they go straight into the swamp where Hatchee-Lustee Creek is, and kind of have a running skirmish through the swamp for the rest of the day. And ford over the stream and get on their side. Colonel Henderson is right in the thick of it, crossing over. And so, anyway, it's hard to say where that is. It seems like from the description, it's spread out in a large battle, and it says it's about halfway across the lake today. And this is more or less known as the headwaters of the Everglades. You think of the Everglades in South Florida, this is more or less the headwaters. And notice also, see if they call it the Big Cypress Swamp, not to be confused with today's Big Cypress Swamp in Southwest Florida. This is another cypress swamp. Looking on a modern map, Lake Toho looks quite different, and that's because over the last 100 years they've built canals and diked it up and changed the water flow. This green strip here, that's the remains of the Hatchee-Lustee Creek, known as Reedy Creek now, and it's kind of a big Disney property, wildlife conservation area. Little close up in this area, you can see it's kind of developed, but it's guess that Jesup or Colonel Henderson and his command kind of got maybe around this area and went straight over to the creek and where nearest part where the swamp gets close to Lake Tahoe Palaika. Uh, Interesting thing is Kawakachi or Wildcat was born on an island in Lake Toho. So anyway, let me read an account. And this is Colonel Henderson's account of the battle. There's General Jesup's account. And actually, I'll read the short version of the story. This is from John Lee Williams, The Territory of Florida. I'll show the books. Let's start back on the 22nd of January. General Jesup marched in pursuit of the enemy, pursuing their trails to the southeast. So he's going to the southeast of, Fort Dade and Fort Armstrong. On the 23rd, Colonel Caulfield, and spelled different ways, but Colonel Caulfield was commanding the Alabama Volunteers, accompanied by Lieutenant Chambers, who's the adjutant of Jesup, was dispatched with the battalion of Alabama Volunteers, Captain Harris's company of Marines, and Major Morris's Indian Warriors. Major Morrison, another Marine officer, in with the Creek Regiment. The Marines commanded the Creek Regiment as well. Kind of interesting to note that the highest officers in the Marines are here in Florida participating in this battle. They attack Osage, who was reported to have a large force near Lake Apopka. They were overtaken, and Osachius, his son, were killed. 9 women and children and 8 Negroes were taken prisoner. The rest of the Indians escaped. One of the friendly Indians was mortally wounded. And one thing about John Lee Williams' book, it was printed in 1837. So this is fresh in the minds of the people who were there. As the trail still continued southeastward, they were vigorously pursued across the sandhills that rise very high above the headwaters of the Ocklawaha. That's the Flahookie, the Great White Sand Mountains, as they called them. The ascent of these hills is so great that a large detail of men were employed to drag ropes to draw up the artillery and baggage on the 24th. On the 27th, numerous herds of cattle were discovered feeding about the prairie of Hatchee Creek and converging of the trails indicating collecting the Indians into one body. A careful reconnaissance was ordered. So I think they're probably on the north end of Lake Toho is probably where they are at that point, and one of the creeks that runs into the Hatchee-Lustee Creek. Colonel Henderson with Colonel Caulfield's battalion, so that's Marine Corps. Colonel Henderson with Colonel Caulfield of the Alabama Volunteers. Harrison's Mounted Marines and Morris's Indians were detached to scour the country and, if possible, bring the enemy to battle. The detachment was accompanied by Lieutenant Chambers, one of the general's aides. The enemy was discovered on Hatchee-Lustee Creek near Uchi Anthlothaco Swamp. They were attacked with vigor. The Indians hastily fled into the swamp. Lieutenant Chambers, at the head of Price's Alabama Volunteers, made a rapid charge on the horses and baggage of the enemy and captured them with 25 women, children, and Negroes. and that was significant. They captured 100 horses, most of them packed with paddle sacks and baggage, severely crippling the Indians at this point. Colonel Henderson pursued the fugitives in the swamp and across Hatchee-Lustee Creek, where they made a short stand but finally scattered and disappeared. So it's kind of a running skirmish across the creek, and Colonel Henderson doesn't shy away from crossing that creek. The first express sent to the General Jesup was shot by the Indians, and a second express was sent. At this period, information was brought in that a large Indian force was lying about 2 miles to the right of the swamp. Major Whitting's battalion being left in reserve, the 6th Infantry with Major Graham's company and a small body of Creek warriors were sent to that point, but the enemy had fled, leaving their fires burning and provisions cooking. So the rest of General Jesup's battalion went in as well. General Jesup was remaining back behind. Night approached, the detachment returned to camp, where they reached about 9 o'clock. And about an hour afterwards, Colonel Henderson also returned. So Colonel Henderson returning at 10 o'clock at night in the dark after being in the swamp pretty much all day. During this day, an Indian woman was taken sick on the trail, and her husband refused to leave her, and they were both taken to the camp. On the 28th, the above-mentioned Indian was sent out to invite Abraham, the interpreter of Micanopy, to come into the camp. The army then moved to Tohoka Lake and took up a strong position on the west bank near where Big Cypress Swamp joins in. Several hundred head of cattle were taken on the border of the lake. So they're, right around between the lake and the swampy area. And so from that, Abraham or General Jesup meets with Abraham and Alligator and sets up a meeting with Abraham, Jumper Alligator, Huartucci, and to meet with Micanopy at Fort Dade, which became the Dade capitulation, and almost ended the war right there to negotiate the removal of the Seminoles that would eventually fail. That was called the Fort Dade capitulation. But tell you about some of the sources that you can look up in the library, or you can even order your own copies. Uh, there's the Territory of Florida by John Lee Williams, and unfortunately, the glossy cover makes it hard to show up. The Seminole War Foundation sells that book, and the letter, word for word, you can read it in John T. Sprague's book, The Florida War, also sold by the Seminole War Foundation, which, anyway, go to the Seminole War Foundation, the website's in there. And also a book that really gets in the information of the officers involved in the battle by David Eckert, U.S. Marines in the Second Creek and Second Seminole War. Very good book. I think he has a website. I'll put it if I could. Okay, there we go. There's the cover of the book. I'll see if I can find that website and put it in the description as well, because that's very significant as well. He's done some several books on the history of the Marines and throughout history, from the Rev War to the Second Seminole War to the was it the or Jamaica occupation or Haiti, I think, in the 1920s. So anyway, he's a good author on that. So anyway, very significant battle in the Second Seminole War. We're not too sure where it is. We have sort of an idea. That area's been somewhat developed today, but hopefully you learned something from this and the significant contribution of the Marines in the Second Seminole War, where they took part in a major battle, and the Commandant of Marines himself took part. Okay, thank you.